Live streaming on Facebook, Spice FM KE, and also on our website, www.spicefm.co.ke. This is the Situation Room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation. Joined on the hot seat this morning by Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Thank you very much for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, and thank you very much. My first time to the studio. It's a great studio. Listeners, you should try and drop in a couple of times and see these fine people.
Good. We love it when a guest starts like
inviting people
that.
to come in. Thank you for starting on such a high note. Fantastic.
Of course, Irungu will be hosting breakfast. Anytime you come, you'll be finding So thank you very much for coming. We'll be talking about the state of civil society. Of course, you know, in the last couple of years, civil society has been christened. It has a new name in politics. But let's first talk about Amnesty International. Tell us about Amnesty International. What is it that you do? Why are you in Kenya? Why is it international Kenya?
So Amnesty International was, formed back in the 60s. It was essentially a movement of citizens that were concerned about the constraints on freedom of expression, and essentially argued that nobody should be killed by state. So therefore, that the death penalty should be abolished. And that was the first mission or mandate of Amnesty. We've now begun to focus globally with our 7 million supporters and 80 or so sections on not just civil and political liberties like the right of expression or the right to assemble, the right to associate, but also to focus on the right to food, the right to education, the right to health, group rights like the rights of women or the rights of persons who are LGBTIQ, lesbians, transgender, and intersex persons. So we have now a very diverse portfolio of support that we can provide citizens whether they are unsafe or indignified by state or civil society action.
What activities are you involved in the country?
So this year we were actually just thinking about this with the team. We've really spent a lot of energy looking at how to bring down the numbers of extrajudicial killings. Young people who are essentially not given due process of law, they're not given access to lawyers, and they are executed by police officers. We've also spent a lot of time looking at the issues of forced evictions, people who are living in very vulnerable housing or shelter conditions, and having them evicted without a compensation or resettlement. And the third one is really health rights denial. These are the three big issues that I think we've been focusing on. But I think probably your listeners are probably also familiar with our work around data protection and the right to privacy. And that has culminated in a new Data Protection Act.
Yeah, we know you about data protection. In fact, you were almost telling us not to subject ourselves to the census. And you had some concerns there. What are those concerns? Do you feel that they were addressed?
So I think the census needs to be looked at in a particular context. There have been no less than 6 fairly invasive policies and initiatives by the executive to either collect data from citizens, and Huduma number was one of those. Census was the second big one. But also there have been proposals to expand and, I guess, extend the reach of CCTV cameras across the country. And what we were worried about is that this move towards a digital age, which we embrace more broadly. I mean, it is really important to have digital data that drives development, that drives policy making. And in the work that we did around the census, we were not against the census. We were against the census being turned into a personally identifiable process rather than an enumeration exercise, which is what it is by the law. So what we have been saying about this process is that we need to have a modern data protection legislation in place. Unfortunately, the Cabinet, the members of Parliament have now given us, as Kenyans, that regulatory framework that protects our right to privacy.
Who do you get your funding from? Is it membership in London or?
Yeah. So Amnesty International Kenya has a budget of 100 million shillings. We have been mostly at that level. 85% of that budget comes from citizens.
Kenyan citizens?
Yes, exactly.
Kenyan citizens?
Yes, absolutely. We have
85 million.
85 million comes from...
How do you collect that money?
Okay, you may
from
need
Kenyan citizens.
I know where you're going. I need to probably respond. So 85 million shillings of our budget comes from citizens all over the world.
Right.
There is an increasing number of them who are now Kenyans. So they are not only, they're not only signing up for membership subscriptions. And anybody who's interested in this, if you don't mind me making a plug, just to show you how serious we are about this,
Right.
please go to our website. That's amnestykenya.org, and you can sign up as a member at any point and join us. But a lot of a lot of our funding actually comes from ordinary citizens across the world. And
Right.
the beauty of that is that there is no pressure on us by any government. We don't necessarily, we don't ordinarily receive money from governments, neither the Kenyan government nor any European or American government.
You say ordinarily. Are there instances when Amnesty receives money from government?
Yes. There's a very limited window that has been opened up by our Executive Council, which is to receive government funding for what we call human rights education. This is education that is not geared towards campaigning. It's not geared to changing policy or legislation. It is essentially trying to create a culture among citizens that human rights is important and that the rights that are under our constitution must be protected. In those circumstances, we will accept government money.
Of course, some of these, or even your funders and these governments, they're quite liberal. So you could be pushing agendas that are very liberal, for instance, with LGBTQI, which there's so many and they keep adding to them. You could be changing a culture, political culture, or culture of a people. So that's external influence. And this is not really my position on it. I'm just playing devil's advocate that you do have to push that liberal culture, don't you, given where you get your funding from?
No, absolutely not. I mean, there is no pressure on either my management team or my board to adopt any position that is popular or a flavor of the month anywhere in the world. Absolutely. The position we take on the right to same-sex intimacy, which was prosecuted through our courts this year, unfortunately, we didn't get the judgment as a country that I think this community deserves, was essentially based on our understanding of what it means to be gay in Kenya today. And essentially what it means is you are essentially going to be vilified, you're going to be intimidated, you could lose your jobs, you can be evicted from your homes. There is actually no legal protection, or rather there's no social protection, because there is legal protection. There is no social protection for persons who are either lesbian, gay, transgender or intersex. And I think that's the position we take. We take it not because it's been taken elsewhere. And just to give you an example of this, I spent a week challenging one of the greatest superpowers in this world last month. I was in the United States of America. I was asked by the Amnesty USA team to essentially go down to the Gulf of Mexico and to investigate inhumane anti-asylum legislation that's been introduced by the American government. Now, if I was an instrument of foreign masters, there is no way that I would have the courage to do that. And probably about 40% of Amnesty funding comes from American citizens. So this narrative of foreign masters is probably stereotypical, at least in the context of Amnesty. And I would just say it's not accurate.
You do approach the West with kiddy gloves, though, don't you, in terms of accusations for things like Guantanamo, the way immigrants have been treated, amongst other things. You're not as loud, you're not as vocal as you are in other countries. Is that not true?
No, I'm just giving an example. If you want to Google the article that I wrote in October, and anybody can do this, it's up on the web, just type Irungu, Houghton, Trump, anti-asylum laws. You'll probably see some language that I think would make you wonder whether I had the courage to write that while I was sitting in Texas, which is a state, let me put it this way, is a state that actually sanctions the death penalty. So it's not... So we've called out, black gun, the lack of gun controls in the U.S. We've called out Guantanamo. That's not a good example. We've actually been very clear on the call for the Guantanamo camp to be closed, and that was an Amnesty position.
Nyeri, when you ask the question, so who are they hard on? Because this I don't know. If they're soft on the West, who are they hard on?
This is an interesting one because I'm on their side, but I still must criticize and sort of ask the
I'm
question.
actually seeking to understand.
They're hard on, you'll find a lot of African conservative countries, which are still to develop socially. They try and come and push a liberal agenda, of which, interestingly enough, I agree with. So in terms of my personal position, I am for amnesty, but there's people that need to be represented. There's cultures and societies that are not ready for some of the rights that you're looking to push. And remember our president actually being interviewed and being asked on his take on homosexuality and the legality in Kenya. And he said it's a non-issue. And I agree with him to the extent that they're not persecuted as such. They're not looked for by the law. There's a way in which we turn the blind eye. So a blind eye, the law does. It doesn't go out looking for gay people to jail them and so forth. And even the way the law has stated it, it's very difficult to be found culpable, like guilty. You have to be found in the act, of which the police are not out looking for this. So that in and of itself tells you that we're embracing it, but at our own pace. Now, what Amnesty International can do is interfere with the culture of another country through foreign money. Now, once you have that, there's no harm in calling it help when it's looked at as help, but there is that interference. We should be let to perhaps grow at our own trajectory. If I was going to accuse or criticize Amnesty International, this is what I would come in and say. Of course, some fundamentals I believe in, like banning the death penalty, but in terms of some social rights, with the West, they have evolved over time and in their time. So with Amnesty International coming and acting as a catalyst with Western money, I know he said some Kenyan citizens contribute to the funding, but I'll be totally honest, these are liberals, usually somebody from North London who reads The Guardian. It's a feel-good factor to give to Amnesty International. And they have their own value system that they're looking through these channels to impose on, let's say, us Africans.
Can we bounce off of that, Irungu, and then say, and then ask, then if you look at the work that you're doing here in Kenya, are human rights, are these rights a priority? With all the battery of things, battery is the word that we're using, with all the battery of other things that are happening right now in the country, and with what you've seen, and in terms of who then has dealt with these issues, is it a priority?
Okay, so let me turn to the narrative that Jerry's creating around this idea that somehow we are extensions of some imperialist agenda that's
liberal.
affecting Africa. Actually, my preoccupation most of the times is actually not foreign masters, it's domestic masters. The human rights abuses that are experienced by Kenyans, whether you are a young person in Dandora, whether you are a Sengwe indigenous person in Embabut Forest, or whether you are a woman who has been detained for over 6 months because you can't pay your medical fees. Those are not foreign master agendas. Those are domestic problems and mismanagement of our constitutions and our constitutional freedoms and rights. Let me come back to the issue of LGBTI, because I get a sense that that's probably where you want to go to. We currently have on our statute books laws that were generated in the 1940s that actually try to regulate the type of sex we have. Now, what I find really interesting with heterosexual Kenyans, so those that do not practice same-sex intimacy, is that they don't realize that
those who claim
not to.
Well, these things are always a spectrum. But anyway, let's deal with that issue.
Really?
So, Section 162 and 165 of our penal code actually make it an offense to have sex in any other way beyond a missionary act. Now, if there's anybody on this table who would be courageous enough to say that they have had sex in any other way
beyond missionary.
Yeah, beyond missionary.
Quite a number of people should be in jail.
Then we're criminals.
We should all be criminalized.
We can define missionary in different ways.
That's a rabbit hole we'd be interested to go down this morning.
Let me turn to the second point, which is the idea that somehow Africa needs to evolve into some of the rights that we are debating in the UK. That's a racist argument, right? Let me just call it as it is. Why it is racist is because it has a modernization logic in it, that somehow Africans are on
excluded.
That we are on a trajectory that the Europe has already reached, and therefore we need to reach.
No, I think your counter-argument is actually quite racist.
Okay, we both call each other racist.
No,
allow me to finish my argument.
This is racist.
Let me finish my argument. And actually, I'm not saying you're racist. Let's be clear. So I'm not saying. Let me.
The argument is racist. Yes.
I'm talking about arguments.
No? Right.
So it's not personalities here. So the argument I think really should be: do Kenyans have a right to the constitutional freedoms, the rights and the responsibilities that are contained in our constitution? So as a rule of law organization, Amnesty basically stops at any point where we are essentially infringing on the constitution. Because I think if you get into that realm, you are essentially dealing with what I would call subjective morality. right? So me as Irungu, I may have a particular agenda in terms of how I would like my home to be constructed, my community, my country. But as Amnesty International, we mainly have to basically have to maintain the rule of law and to essentially uphold the Constitution as it is.
As it is. What approaches do you use? Maybe that's where the issues would come in. So
what challenges do you face at the same time?
Because we see you, for example, let's say taking a case to court or doing public demonstrations. But when it comes to these things that are pieces of statute in law, what approaches do you use, for example, trying to ensure that this law is changed, campaigning to change the law, supporting or sponsoring even an amendment to those laws, even going as far as trying to understand where people are? When the president of Kenya says, this is not an issue yet in my country, this is a non-issue, do you actually sit back and ask yourself, what does he mean? Have you gone around the country and sought their people's opinion? Is this an issue? Is homosexuality an issue for you right now?
Yeah. So I think the president's comment, like Jerry, I would say I would support the comment he made. The essence of his comment was that no gay person should be persecuted for the choices that they're making. They should not be denied work. They should not be abused. They should not be physically attacked. They should not be mentally intimidated. And in that sense, I think that was statesmanship on his part, because he must know that in this country, much as some of us are in denial, that there is a community of people who practice a different sexual identity, who have a different sexual identity, and who practice different sexual preferences. And most of that is consensual. So he's not talking about some violent sexual predator that chooses to prey on children, as sometimes this issue is drawn into. He's talking about people who consensually accept to have partners of the same sex that they love. So I think that was the spirit in which he made that comment. Does it mean that our law books are in need of reform? I think that's the case. As Amnesty International, we don't work directly on LGBTIQ legal issues, and the institution that does that extremely well is the Lesbian Gay Human Rights Commission and GALC. What we have done over this year is we have basically 4 strategies, and maybe I can step back a little bit. Human rights organizations started and have a DNA that is built around essentially being anti-state and naming and shaming. Right? And this is part of our DNA. We grew up in this space, and in a sense, this is the bread and butter of our work. For Amnesty International Kenya, over the last 2 years, we've realized that actually this is not effective. Right? It's not effective in a context that there are people in government, good, decent, Chapter 6, Chapter 4, Bill of Rights champions that are in government, and that we need to build alliances with them. And we have done that very effectively. So the first thing is dialogue with the state. We are part of the multi-agency task force with the Ministry of Interior, which some people may find a bit interesting given how vocal we are on violence, police violence. We have direct contact with many of the cabinet secretaries, the principal secretaries, on the issues that are important to Amnesty. The second thing we do is we do promote public action. We do promote public assembly, demonstrations and pickets. I've probably been on 15 demonstrations since I joined Amnesty. And they've been on everything from raising awareness around climate change and to issues around the Willie Kimani case, which is the case of the lawyer that was killed by police officers. That's in court. We do litigation work. Currently we're managing, or rather we're overseeing 5 cases that, if they go in the favor of the victims, will be extremely important. And the last thing we do is public awareness, and that's why I'm here with Spice, and I'm hoping to continue having more conversations.
I know we're going to go on a break in a short while, but I think it's very important for us to ask then, in terms of covering area, how far have you actually gone? And I'll ask that question maybe with some more depth in a short bit.
Yeah, when come out of the break, we have in the studio Mr. Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. Let's allow him to have a sip of water, and then we come back and continue the conversation. This is a situation room. It's Kenya's biggest conversation. You are here with us, C.T. Muga, Nyeri, Thorn, Ndu Oko. My name is Eric Latif, and of course, on the hot seat, Irungu Houghton. You wanted to go deeper into this question.
Well, for as long as I can remember, I think I've quoted several Amnesty reports in terms of what is happening around the world. And if we look at Kenya, for example, the report after report after report of what the situation is. Has that changed anything? Because obviously these reports are just not available to the members of the public. They're available to government as well, in terms of your findings, from extrajudicial killings to what you talked about earlier about keeping people detained because they're not able to pay their bills. Has that changed as a result of the work that you do?
Yes, I mean, I think the first thing is documentation, because I think many human rights abuses are leave victims in silence. They're not able to actually raise their issues. And what we found is that the more that we document them, the more we bring them to the attention of duty bearers, and the public, we are able to get a traction that leads to results. And just to give you an example, a recent example was the demonstration that went horribly violent at Jomo Kenyatta College, Agriculture College, earlier last month, I think it was. And all of us were furious and outraged by the violence that we saw in that of the student being beaten by police officers. And I think the public pressure really produced the conditions under which not only did the minister and the inspector general speak on this issue, but they also moved to interdict the 3 out of the 4 officers. Now we're still waiting for the 4th to be named, and also for them to be brought into legal proceedings. And we hope that the Internal Affairs Unit and the Independent Policing Oversight Authority do this.
Is this as a result of the agitation by Amnesty? Do you think would it have not happened if you didn't?
So as Amnesty, we try and be a bit kind of humble in terms of our impact. I think for us, we see ourselves essentially as amplifying the voices of decent citizens who believe in human rights and our members. So I think the first place that I would look to for recognition really was the numbers of people who shared that video, who demanded attention. And it got to a point where I think even in State House, that issue was discussed. And I think that's the kind of country that produces the kind of safety and dignity for all. It's not really Amnesty growing 10 times in its size. We work currently in 6 counties, and we have an outreach to about 2,500 students every week. We do human rights education with them. We have probably about 10 core alliances of civil society organizations. I spend probably 3 to 4 hours a week in a media station, in the media, essentially talking about human rights. So there is a certain volume of engagement that I think Amnesty needs to have, but I think it is nothing compared to what needs to happen in terms of our own consciousness. And let me just be a bit provocative, because I believe that you also have quite a number of middle-class listeners. The middle class has to take responsibility for the future of this country, and they cannot just hide behind Wi-Fi hotspots and the malls, and really step up and begin to look at this country as a whole. And we saw that even in the BBI report.
We talk about that quite a lot in terms of then what can we do, or what must we do, because it can be shrouded in a lot of ambiguity as concerns. All right, what can I actually do? Something tangible that I can do. And you can say, Irungu, don't hide behind the keyboard, don't hide behind the mobile phone. But what do I do? And if we look at it in the face of, for example, extrajudicial killings, you have a bunch of youth who could be said to be rowdy, and then after some time they disappear, and you can see that happening over and over again. Apart from raising my voice and saying that, look, I know this is happening, what can people actually do? And I think that's a question that a lot of people have. What can we actually do tangibly?
So the first thing I think is that people must continue to remain behind the keyboards. They must continue to do their smartphones smartly. That's why they're called smartphones. Don't just use them to crunch data. Use them to raise your voice, to amplify your concern, not just when things go wrong, but actually even when things go right. And that's the other side of it. Is actually giving positive affirmation to what government needs to do. There are maybe 4 or 5 things that any citizen can do. The first one is join Amnesty. Right. The second one is donate to human rights organizations. As we speak now, the Defenders Coalition, this is one of our oldest human rights defenders organization. About 25 of them are climbing Mount Kenya to raise money for Haki Center. This is a center that is going to provide training and resources for any citizen who wants to know how to report human rights violations, how to investigate, report, and to take action on these things. So this will be the second area. And they will be coming back down, I think, on Friday. I'm going to join them in
What
Nyeri.
peak are they hoping to reach?
I would have to check, actually. I'm not really sure which one, whether they've gone for the top or whether they've gone for...
No, with this weather, they wouldn't.
They wouldn't be able to make it.
It would be harmful.
Even if they're human rights defenders.
It doesn't matter.
No, they're not heroes, no.
No, human rights defenders are always heroes. Let me turn to another example. And, so professionals. Human rights and the realization of human rights cannot be cannot happen in the absence of professional ethics. I spent 3-4 hours with the whistleblowers of Masai Mara University yesterday, and I was intrigued by their level of courage. I was intrigued by their level of patriotism, that they were willing to essentially stand up and challenge the pillaging of a public institution.
Right.
And last night I was with a group of lawyers. This was the Law Society Amnesty Pro Bono Jurist of the Year. And I listened to people like Tabitha Sayo Griffiths or Ramadan Abu Bakr. These are 2 lawyers who are using their legal skills essentially either to promote the right to sexual and reproductive health rights, or in the case of Ramadan, a really interesting thing. Most of us know now that if you are injured, and you go to the if you go to the either the government pathologist or to the police station and request for a P3 form, that form is free. You do not have to pay for that. What we forget is actually it was Ramadan that took a court case, that actually introduced a court case and won a court case to make it free and to criminalize any attempt for you to have to go looking for photocopies or to pay for this. Now, professional ethics in this country is also one way that you can safeguard human rights. If you're an accountant, don't allow shady deals to take place in your institution.
Under your watch.
If you're a lawyer, prosecute cases that have public interest capacity.
All right.
I want to we talked about that yesterday, or maybe we'll talk about it a little bit more in a few minutes. But I'm going to come back to that question in terms of human rights, a priority at the level of the custodians of the country. And now I'm talking about government. At that point, are they, from what you've seen, are they really a priority? I can tell you what the answer is from people who are the common man. It would be no. It's in terms of a shopping list of things that need to be done in this country, it does not feature in the top 10.
So I can respond in 2 ways. The first one is we commissioned an opinion poll for International Human Rights Day yesterday. It was a global poll, but the Kenyan findings essentially, and what was interesting actually, we just interviewed what they call Generation Z, which I had to, or is it Z, depending on where you're from, you studied, right?
Oh, yes.
So this is between 17 and 25 years. Right? Now, what they said was a number of things. They said they are extremely scared about joblessness. They are scared about corruption. And they're scared, lastly, about not being able to pay medical bills or being able to get medical service. These are the fears. And they're all human rights concerns.
Right.
The second one was, do you feel that the government of Kenya is doing enough to protect human rights? And 45%, I think it was 44% of the respondents said no, they do not. Right. So this is from the, from the opinion polls that we got. As Amnesty Kenya, what we realize is that actually these binary arguments about whether the government is useless or useful in terms of human rights, it's not really helpful. Right. There are specific contexts in which we have actually had tremendous movement on human rights as a result of pressure from civil society in collaboration with human rights champions within government. And that's a reality. There are other issues that have got stuck, cases that have not progressed, and we continue to press the authorities to make sure that those cases happen. So I think what we need to be a bit more nuanced in terms of our thinking is that actually there are different issues that need to be handled differently, and therefore there is no one silver bullet or one silver strategy for human rights.
We'll be opening up the phone lines in about 5 minutes. This is the situation of Kenya's biggest conversation. 0719-012-600. Ask a question or pose a comment to Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International Kenya. He's the one who's on the hot seat this morning.
I want to come back to that comment that you rebutted my argument that Africa should do things at our own pace, and you said actually that's a racist approach in terms of the framing of my argument. Isn't it derogatory to suggest that your yardstick and your measure, when I say your, it's the West, because you do have a Western bias as Amnesty International, given where most of your money comes from, your ideals, of course, are underpinned by achievements by the West in terms of where they've reached for their human rights. So it's this yardstick, because if you look at the treatment of, let's say, homosexuals in Kenya, they do turn a blind eye. We've got our own framework and our own set of rules. We don't need to actually adopt that blueprint, which is what you're imposing on us through some of your activities. So it's not like anybody has been jailed for being gay. But as a society, we've actually created a homegrown solution as opposed to copy-pasting your blueprint from the West into how you came to be, whereby people are enjoying these civil rights.
And what is this homegrown solution?
Well, you can see, first of all, turning a blind eye, for example, is an example of a way in which we go about it. You don't see the law actually actively looking for homosexual people to jail them. So that is an example of the fact that we are dealing with it in our own method, where nobody is actually being persecuted for it. But what Amnesty International does, because of their Western bias, they want us to use their blueprint. In the same way we have been forced to use their version of democracy for governance, and we're coming to a place where actually we're realizing this one-size-fits-all doesn't work. We're now having that imposition from the West. He knows exactly what I'm talking about. I have three questions. I haven't finished.
Actually,
this was one question. I'm coming to Osama and whether that was an extrajudicial killing.
It isn't a question, Jerry. You have started with a certain Western bias and lumped...
Western bias? I'm against the West.
And lumped it with Amnesty International. And I'm thinking...
Amnesty International is constantly accused
of offices everywhere
funded by
Japan, in Saudi Arabia. So you're saying all these offices have this bias that
in
you speak
terms of ideologies and perspective and lens through which they look at things, it is a Western bias, whether inadvertently or not. There is a Western bias. In fact, this is one of the biggest criticisms for Amnesty. I'm sure Irungu would agree with me. So that is my first.
I don't actually.
That is my first.
I'm just
question.
waiting for you to get to your question.
in terms of the
your
criticism
questions have
that you
lead comments. Huh? So it's there's a Kenyan habit which we say we're going to ask a question and then you start with a comment and then I will lose the question. So if you have a question for me, please ask me.
Okay, I want to ask the first question. Did you consider Osama extrajudicial killing? That's the first question, because Osama bin Laden, when he was killed, was that an extrajudicial killing? Because I think there's instances, and I'm not advocating for extrajudicial killings here, but there are instances where, given what we can do as Kenyans, or maybe we're fighting terrorism and things are highly dynamic and complex, there have been killings of certain individuals that Amnesty have then come in and interfered with or tried to defend, whereas we don't see the same approach with the West, because the West has managed to frame theirs as terrorism and everybody hated Osama. So even your approach to the drone killings by Obama, you weren't very loud there. It's just this something that's almost hypocritical. You're not loud with the West, and I said it earlier, you approach them with kiddie gloves. But when it comes to Africa, whereby things are being done because maybe without taking context, that maybe we can't afford to have the policing that we need, so there's a higher principle of protecting society. And yes, there are extrajudicial killings, and criminals are being killed without having to go through the court system because maybe we don't have the financial muscle.
You had 3 questions.
No, but it's important that I give the background as well. And he understands where this is going. It's also a debate. I'm not here just to get information. It's important that he understands where I'm coming from. And it's important that I let my listeners realize that there is this Western bias and that we do have homegrown solutions.
Can you respond to that
can you respond to that in terms of where, if there was an extrajudicial killing when Obama was, or rather when Osama was murdered, was killed?
So there are 3 questions I kind of hear. The first is, it's a perennial conversation, I think, around the Western bias, the Western influence. I think I've responded to that effectively. And I think people need to just judge for themselves, look at our material, look at our work, try and connect the connections. I mean, I don't know if you're suggesting that I'm an agent of Trump or Boris Yeltsin, Boris or
that seems
Putin.
To be the general suggestion.
No, not at all.
So you can read I guess the narratives of all these leaders and look at what we stand for and see if there's a correlation. Then that's fine. But on the issue of LGBTIQ groups, I think one of the facts of this, this particular community is that, and I was just looking for the figures, there's a study that's been done for Eastern Africa, and one of the things that they says is that this community faces 3 times more abuse and violence than heterosexual women and men. Right? That's a fact you cannot deny. Now, as Amnesty International, we have a position that says all human beings, not just the ones we like, not just the ones that look like us, that do things like us, they must be safe and dignified. On the third point you've raised around Osama, I can look up what was the Amnesty USA position on Osama. In fact, even some of your listeners may be doing this as we look at it. I'm not familiar on the particular case, but I can actually pull it up before the end of the show. And we've been criticized on Assange as well, and I can look up our position on that one. I think you're talking to the Amnesty International Kenya director. I'm on much better ground sharing with you what our position is on extrajudicial killings in Kenya, and what we know about extrajudicial killings in Kenya is that there are no less than about 80 young men and women that have been denied the opportunity of a lawyer. They've been denied the opportunity of going to court, and they essentially have been shot. Young men like Carlton Maina, like Evans Njoroge, like Gitau Mwara. I could go on and on and on. The young man from Garissa, Yusuf Hassan, who was shot by KDF officers in circumstances that are still unclear to us. So on extrajudicial killings, and I think if the Inspector General is listening to me now, or the Ministry of Interior, I know they're probably saying, Irungu, we don't have a policy on extrajudicial killings. I agree, there is no public policy. What we have been saying as Amnesty is that there needs to be an active policy on discouraging, arresting and prosecuting officers that act outside of the standing orders and who are contrary to our Constitution.
I think that was one of the questions I asked previously, because, we're in 2019, and obviously you've been reporting, if I want to look at just extrajudicial killings over time, we're talking about years and years. There have been many a report, many times a year over this. So then when we look at the side of government having a policy, and then again, in terms of the influence, because we can talk about people talking about it. We can talk about the middle class continuing their keyboard warriorism, as it were. But then in terms of what can be done at a level whereby it will deter forces from taking out these actions on individuals, it seems that we've not gone anywhere. Even with all the lobbying and the picketing and the activism, it seems that nothing has been done. If the reason would be that we don't have an active policy, so therefore we cannot act, then how effective then is all this reporting that has been done from Amnesty? Because Irungu, come on, it would be you that we look at in this case as a watchdog, and that is the word that's been used many times.
No, I think there's we have not turned the corner on violent policing and abuse of office and excessive force. We have not turned that corner. So that's the overall point. Have we had victories? Absolutely. Right, so the police officer that shot Evans Njoroge is now in court, having to plead his innocence in circumstances that are fairly clear that extrajudicial force was used in that case, or he was executed. In the case of that we've had probably this year the most number of police officers convicted of violence than I think we've had in probably over a decade. Right. So there are some successes, and I think this is the. And I gave the example of JKUAT just recently, that people who just shared that video actually caused the interdiction of those 3 officers, possibly 4. So I think I would just start, I would end the year with a sense of hope that actually where citizens take action, where they are courageous, you do see results.
Right. I know that a lot of times you don't go shouting about these successes, so sometimes it's not easy to see then in terms of work that has been done. But obviously you do, I'm sure, a lot of comparative analyses between where you're resident here, where you're domiciled as Amnesty, compared to other countries in the world. Would you say that Kenya, in terms of its rating, is doing okay with as far as human rights are concerned, compared to some of the other places that you see? That doesn't mean we rest on our laurels, of course, but I'd like to hear what that is in terms of comparative analysis.
So for Amnesty, all lives matter. So if one person, if we were left with a program that was only protecting one Kenyan citizen, for me that would have value. But of course, scale and complexity across the world varies. So I was in a meeting just recently with colleagues from Brazil, and I said, we have, at that point, it was 70 unexplained disappearances and killings. And the Amnesty director looked at me, the Amnesty International Brazil director looked at me and said, Irungu, I deal with 7,000. Right? So the scale in a place like Brazil, or if I talk to my Nigerian director who's dealing with Boko Haram and violent army interventions, the scale is much higher. But I think for us as anybody who lives in Kenya as a project that is going to be framed by our constitutional principles must be not just disturbed, but even outraged by any possibility that any citizen, regardless of their age, regardless of their ethnicity, and I would add again sexuality, that they should be in any way more likely to be abused physically or mentally by another Kenyan. I think that's the promise of the Constitution. And if we were a country looking for a Constitution before 2010, we are now a country looking for we are now a Constitution looking for a country. And our role is to create that.
Talking about the civil and political liberties that you talked about, there's a time in this country when civil society was the darling of the public. When we were pushing for the second liberation, and all the members of the civil society were really good. And then recently we have seen cases where the political class in particular has labeled the civil society as the evil society because of what you've been pushing. And then we have seen sort of reduced activities by the civil society organizations in the country. Are you saying that, do you see like the evil society tag has actually worked in sort of suppressing the work of civil society organizations?
I think the thing we have to recognize, those of us who are in civil society, and by the way, civil society is not NGOs. It is the entire civic space that involves, Mama Mboga associations, border associations,
the
and
Situation Room.
Yeah, the Situation Room. In fact, you're a very key part of civil society, perhaps.
We're media. We're not civil society.
Okay, then you can divide media into a little group of its own. But I think for me, the thing that we have to acknowledge is that, first of all, context is always decisive, right? The context has shifted. So for many societies across the world, Kenya is not an exclusion. We now have populist leaders who way of working essentially is to divide the population and create intolerance and fear so that they can govern based on people's fears rather than their aspirations. And that's the context in which we operate. So if you're not a pop star, if you're not a preacher, if you're not a politician or a PR agent, you actually have very little voice in this new dispensation across the world. And that's why, for example, as Amnesty, we value the media. The media is critical in terms of creating, I guess what you'd call, a plural society that is tolerant, not just tolerant, because that's a terrible word. There's not just tolerant, but is actually accepting of a diversity of views. So I think for me, the context has shifted. You need to put in that context also a drop of about 40% of development financing. Right, for governments and human rights organizations, there's been 40% less funding available to do human rights work. And that's why, I keep challenging Kenyans. How long do you want North Americans and Europeans to fund your human rights protection work? At what point, as a sovereign, and this is to Jerry, because I get, there's a kind of a sovereignty argument that comes through in your position. How long must our work be funded by non-Kenyans? And we now have the mechanism, we have the capacity in Amnesty to absorb support from Amnesty from Kenyans, and that's the way that we need to work. So I think that's the way forward in terms of the civil society organizations. I don't think we're evil. I think we are part of the society more broadly. But I think more importantly, we have to provide leadership where there is none.
Let's take another short break so you can have another sip of water and then open up the phone line 0719-012-600. This is broadcasting from Nairobi on 94.4. We're in Mombasa, Kisumu, Nakuru, Eldoret, Nyeri, and of course Malindi. We have on the hot seat this morning Irungu Houghton. He's the Executive Director of Amnesty International.
If it comes to simply the reports and the record of human rights work that Amnesty has done, without question, they are beyond compare. But I want to ask one question, Irungu. How well do you manage differences of opinion within the organization? How well do you manage internal strife?
Within Amnesty?
Yes. You want me to give the case in point?
You can give it examples or...
2010.
Context.
Certain lady by the name of Gita Sagai. She was a gender unit head. And she had a problem that Amnesty International working with someone by the name of Moazam Beg. And she said this gentleman had close ties to the Taliban. Amnesty, of course, said that is not the reason why they let go of her. But opinions differed on this particular subject.
So, and the Taliban guy remained.
To be honest, I'm stumped. Charles is extremely decisive in terms of where you found that piece of information. Again, I can take it away like the Osama case. I mean, more broadly, I think, so I joined Amnesty thinking I was joining an NGO. right? Because in the Kenyan context, we've operated a bit like an NGO. We do human rights work. We don't give platforms and opportunities for people to take action for themselves. Although we've had a good record in terms of building community capacities around issues like, for example, gender-based violence or forced evictions, we haven't actually. My ambition is really to have a country where people who are interested in this work can actually come download tools, figure out how to build circles of conscience, chapters of conscience on campuses and schools, so that actually we begin to generate the ethical national values that would essentially, free us from prejudice and discrimination, right? So this is kind of the ambition side of it. As a movement, we actually have a very complex process of agreeing our policies and procedures, right? So we call it the law policy debates. Every year we have a global assembly. So the membership, our chief executives and our chairpersons and our representatives from the members across the world meet, and we actually go through all the new legal positions and the policy positions that are being put before the movement. So just to give you an example, last year we started thinking about, what does it mean? Let me give you one. What does it mean to have millions of women dying from unsafe abortion? Right? And this is a controversial one.
Yes.
But I'm going to do this because I think it's important to realize that even internally within Amnesty, we have controversial debates. And many of our members said that it was premature for us to take a position on the right to safe abortion. There were a number of Amnesty staff and supporters that said, no, if we look at the figures, without providing an alternative to the backstreet clinics that essentially operate all over the world, we are essentially condemning women to very dangerous medical experiments. So we have those debates. And even in my office, let me just give you a sense of what it's like to be the executive director. I recruit human rights activists. The one thing about a human rights activist is that they will be against something, right? The second thing about them is that they will be very skillful and very clear about how to do power mapping and how to essentially lobby for positions, right? So a simple administrative issue becomes a complex, politically charged adaptive issue. Now, I embrace it. I'm not complaining. And if I know my staff are listening to me and they'll be like, oh gosh, have you brought out the laundry? No, I'm just being real, that actually part of a democracy is the ability to kind of absorb different perspectives on issues and manage them in a fair administrative way, so that even if we take a direction, which I, as the executive director, announce, that I have listened to people and that I have taken those views into consideration. And I think that's the same for all organizations. I kind of wish that, even media corporations would work that way, and businesses and, ministries.
So has Amnesty gone beyond watchdog status? Around 2008, it was that Amnesty International in the country as the watchdog on issues of human rights. Is it beyond that, whereas you're looking around and then stamping out issues as they pop up? Or are we saying now, beyond stamping them out, can we do something or create a conducive environment for them not to thrive? So what status then are you seeing now Amnesty holding here?
Yeah, that's a great one. It's actually a global conversation, because we're about to release a global strategy. And the question was, who are we? Are we watchdog? Are we an empowering and enabler of other human rights organizations? Are we a research body? And so we had this big debate. I think for me in Kenya, I think we've grappled between two identities and potentially a third. The first is a paramedic. Are we the ones that come out with the ambulance when people are hurt, to essentially pronounce, judgment on what's happened and to seek redress? That's the first option. The second one is, are we researchers? Is our job simply to document human rights abuses? But I like to think of Amnesty as interrupters. That we're the ones that put out the fires. Right? We're the ones that preempt the possibility of human rights violations, so that every time we take action, and actually, if I could just tell the listeners a little bit, the one thing that is very familiar to most people who know Amnesty is the candle, and the candle and the barbed wire.
And the barbed wire.
That candle, we light that candle every time we fail to save a life. Right, so it's not just it's a candle of hope, but it's also a candle of recognition that we were not effective enough to protect people. So I think for that logic, as interrupters, we have to find a way of getting, building alliances both within the state and within civil society and within the market. This is the other conversation that we've been having. I've spent, maybe I think it's about 10-15 hours with different Rotary clubs this year. And when I suggested this, people said, why would you talk to Rotary? They are basically philanthropic, welfare-oriented. You're hardline human rights activists. And I said, no, we actually want the same thing. We want people to be dignified. We want people to be able to take action. And those conversations have been very enriching for me.
Do you think that sometimes you go at a loss when we're trying to protect or care for the rights of, would you go at a loss, and is that loss explainable, or then it would be taken into consideration as something that we have to give away in order to get a bigger piece of the pie?
Just rephrase that again.
Do you think that sometimes you'd have to in terms of protecting human life, or in terms of protecting human rights, are there times where you have to take a loss in order to get a greater gain? Protecting some rights and saying, okay, like for example, would you compromise in one way to be able to get a bigger part of the pie? When you look at things like asking people to be whistleblowers when it comes to things that they see. So here's an individual who would then basically live in fear for the rest of their life because of the fact that they want to talk about the things that they see and bring it out into the open. Is that something that you compromise on to get this bigger percentage of success, as it were?
So this work has dilemmas, and it also has dangers. And to give you one of the dilemmas of this year was during the census, for example. This was a high-stake public policy issue. It affected every single person in the Republic. We were not informed, or we did not know that these 3 additional questions were going to be added to the census, and they were added after the pilot. Right now, the judgment call of this, and there was an article that I did just to make this really clear to the state and also to the Republic, which was essentially to say that the census is probably the most important exercise in terms of policy making. If you don't do a census, you cannot plan for health. You cannot plan for any form of public essential services. You can't even figure out how to distribute allocation. The resources to the counties. But at the same time, it endangered people. Why? Because it meant that you as an individual, with all the things, the information, 60 points of data that you've given the government, your GPS location was collected, your name was collected, and your ID was collected. Now, this has an impact for lots of different types of groups, including, I would say, the intersex persons, who for the first time in the history of Kenya, and probably one of the first or second times in the world, they've actually been included in a census. That was a dilemma for us. So we asserted the importance of the census, but at the same time we warned Kenyans and left it to Kenyans to make their own judgment.
Make their own choices.
And I think that relates to the second point around dangers, which is that we take precaution, very serious precaution for all of the things that we do that potentially will have a backlash. Now, we can make those precautions, and sometimes, we misread the context and the mood, and, the backlash is very direct on our staff or on our members. But most of the time, there is a precautionary conversation that happens around safety of all our staff and everybody who's involved.
Irungu, 1 hour is a very short time, as you've noticed. We've come to the end of the 1 hour. I want to thank you very much for joining us this morning. So I'll give you just 30 seconds to give you closing remarks. Don't send shout-outs to the people who are listening to you in the office. Closing remarks to the country in terms of civil liberties and all, and rights.
I think the closing remark for me would be essentially this. If we want a country that is a match for our constitution, then we have to stand up as a country. We have to take actions beyond our smartphones and our computers and our laptops. We have to be active on them, but we have to go beyond that. And I think there are 3 things that people can do. They can help to resource human rights organizations. They can speak out publicly. And they can also join organizations like the Defenders Coalition or Amnesty or any of the human rights organizations out there. And that this is a noble, step to take as people who believe in a country that can be greater than we have currently.
Thank you very much. We wish you a happy Jamhuri Day tomorrow.
Thank you.
Right, and of course, happy holidays as well.